Welcome to Fading Causes with me, Mukesh Kapila. My guest has seen far too much history than can be good for anyone's digestion. He's not just observed the human condition, but interrogated it so that the rest of us can make some sense of it. His arena is Africa, for which he's well qualified, having been born in South Africa during apartheid. But he's ranged far and wide, including spending 20 years with the BBC, where he became its Africa editor. Words are his business, and he's wielded them powerfully, millions of words, in scores of articles and dozens of books. Pretty enlightening stuff. His name is Martin Plott. Martin, welcome to Fading Causes. I'm somewhat spoiled for choice on what to talk to you about. We could talk many episodes about your adventures, but let us focus on your latest book, Unbroken Chains. Let's start you telling us about yourself, your upbringing. You're a white African. How's that shaped you?
Well, it certainly shaped me. I was born in Cape Town. My first memory is hearing the muezzin calling across the city from what was then called the Malay Quarter. It was a Muslim quarter in the center of Cape Town, and people there were themselves mostly descendants of slaves. I mean, it was called Malay, but they were really from Indonesia or from Bengal mostly. And that shaped me a lot. Of course, you can't grow up under apartheid without becoming aware of race, and I got involved in many elements of that, mostly trying to fight what apartheid had done to my city and to my people.
Well, I think apartheid, surely everyone must know, at least South African apartheid. But the word apartheid nowadays is used for so many other things. For example, Israeli rule in the occupied Palestinian territories, Chinese segregation of the Uyghurs or the way they run minorities, or in Myanmar, Muslim Rohingya, the way they are segregated by the dominant Buddhist majority. Or we might talk about the ghettos of America, not to forget my country of birth, India, and its untouchable castes, even to this day. But you were the original apartheid warrior. As a young man, you got involved in the Soweto uprising, an iconic event. What was all that about, and how did you do your uprisings in those days compared to how people rise up today?
Well, that was a second thing that I really got involved with. The first thing was in 1973 at the University of Cape Town. The black trade unions had been crushed, and I got involved with something called the Wages Commission, which was looking at the appalling wages that black workers were being paid. It was one of the most successful things the students ever did, because within about 3 or 4 years, we were catalytic. And the beginnings of the black trade union movement had taken off. And after a while, they said to us, look, guys, thanks for your help, but you're real amateurs. And we don't need your help anymore. And we said, fantastic. And it was the most powerful thing we ever did, because it was the unions that really took on the apartheid state. They were the backbone of what became known as the United Democratic Front, which united almost everybody in South Africa who was opposed to apartheid, and then confronted the South African government. The Soweto uprising of 1976 was a different event. Happened in Johannesburg. I was there at the time. It was the attempt to force the use of Afrikaans, a language that most young black people in Soweto didn't speak, nor did their teachers. And they were told you need to teach things like mathematics in Afrikaans. And people said, you can't do it. It's crazy. They took to the streets. We students tried to help them, because very soon it became clear that the children were being shot down. I mean, literally shot down by the South African police. We thought maybe 15, 20 had been killed in the first day, and we marched into the center of Johannesburg. We were completely wrong. Between 100 and 200 children were shot down in the first day alone. It was absolute bedlam. And it shaped a lot of our lives. And people were absolutely horrified by what happened. So I was involved, but the real players were the children, the black children of Soweto, who went out and took on the police in an absolutely fearless way.
Coming to your book, Unbroken Chains, your publishers, Hearst, sent me an advance copy. The book, I believe, is released in August. I couldn't put it down, to be quite honest. I could see that it's a labor of love, meticulously researched. I see your indignity, your passion blistering through the pages. I thought I knew a lot about the slavery topic. But clearly I was wrong, and certainly this book was an eye-opener. But Martin, slavery is a fashionable topic. Many tomes have been written about it. Why did you think there was need for another one, and what is your book really about that puts it apart from the others?
Well, let me begin by how I got interested. I started writing a biography of somebody called Abdullah Abdurrahman, who's somebody very little known about, yet he was one of the most extraordinary South Africans ever to live. He was somebody who knew Gandhi, he knew the leader of the British Labour Party, Keir Hardie. He was a giant, but he himself was a grandson of a slave. And he lived in Cape Town. He was 40 years. He was a city councillor. He was the first person ever to be elected in South Africa in 1904, because there was a non-racial constitution in the Cape. It was a male-only constitution. You had to have property, but it was non-racial. And he got elected to the city council and would certainly have been the mayor of Cape Town if he had had a chance. But over time, I began to realize I really knew very little about the enslavement of people that had led them to live in the Cape. And how had they got there? They'd been brought by the Dutch mostly, but why were they there? What did the Dutch use them for? And I began looking at the Indian Ocean slavery. And that opened my eyes, because everything that we've heard about the transatlantic slave trade is true, but it's only a small part of the story. And as I began to look at the Indian Ocean slave trade, I began to see other slave trades with Africa. For example, the Ottoman Empire, that took nearly 1.5 million people over many hundreds of years. It was something I knew absolutely nothing about, and it was the depth of my own ignorance that drove me onwards.
Can you give us a bit of a global picture about historic slavery, transatlantic as well as the other form? How many people were affected, and trends to the present day?
The first evidence that we have of slavery is etched on the rocks of the Nile. 2,900 years BC is the first etching. From then onwards, you see people brought up the Nile by the Egyptians under various pharaohs and then under other regimes to be used as slaves in Egypt. That's where we know it began. And if you want to know where it ends today, there are still people enslaved in Africa. And if you want to go then wider, you have to look at who was involved, how they were involved, what did they do. And just to give an idea of the scope, nobody's really tried to put together a figure before of the number of Africans who enslaved. And I've used very conservative figures. If you take the largest number, the Indian Ocean slavery was about 12.5 million slaves. The transatlantic slavery was a shorter period, but again about 12.5 million. They were essentially the same size. And then you get the other forms of enslavement. And if you take the totality, you get something like 50 million Africans who were enslaved. And this is using very conservative figures. But we have to be extremely careful, because these figures are at best estimates, because even the most carefully researched analysis, for example, on the transatlantic slave trade, which has been studied now for many years with great care, shows that the numbers are maybe 10 to 18% out. So, I think we shouldn't get too bogged down with the actual numbers and just see the scale of it. And if 50 million is right, that is a huge number of people.
And what were the mechanics? You mentioned the Ottomans, you mentioned Egyptians, and obviously transatlantic slavery across the Indian Ocean and so on. How did it happen? What was the day-to-day mechanics of enslavement?
Well, slavery was mostly undertaken by people in Africa itself. By that I mean that the beginnings of the slavery process were done by African elites, whether they were called chiefs or pharaohs or however you describe them. Those people who ran their own communities. They enslaved people nearby, people they were at war with, people they had disputes with. And they brought them either for their own purposes, women for pleasure, or for in the household. Men were used to fight or farming and, to carry things. That went on throughout that 5,000 years. And they then were sold to people close to them if people wanted to trade, or gradually over a period of time, they were sold to other people. So, for example, the Ethiopians have a history of trading with the Arabia, and they sent their own people across the Red Sea to Arabia, and then the Omanis frequently sent them onwards to India, and indeed as far as China. That's one route. There are many others. For example, the Omanis went across the entire width of Africa, from the coast of Angola, marching people over 2 years and more to the coastline and taking them to Zanzibar, and then onwards to places like Reunion, where they were used in the French sugar plantations. It is a very complicated story, but essentially it was African elites that traded them with either Europeans or Arabs or Ottomans or whoever wanted them.
But the dominant narrative is that the white man came and enslaved the black man. So the Arabs traded, the Indians benefit from it, and so did the Chinese. So the pattern is emerging. Why are the Africans' own responsibilities for feeding this nefarious trade not being discussed by Africans themselves?
That's a very good question. But let me make one thing clear. I'm not saying that anybody has more or less responsibility for this. Everybody has a hand in what took place and the appalling suffering of the people of Africa. It was said that you could smell the dead bodies coming across Africa right the way to Zanzibar. You could follow the camel routes across the Sahara by the corpses of Africans who died being brought across by Arabs or Berbers. The suffering is just immense. In general, outsiders didn't go into Africa and enslave people. It was the African chiefs and leaders who enslaved their own people and then traded them along the coastline. Now, that wasn't always true. The Portuguese went deep into Angola and deep into Mozambique and did indeed go hunting for slaves themselves, just as the Omanis went deep into Africa as far as the Congo River, looking for people, and even further in some cases. So it's complicated, but essentially most slaves were enslaved by their own people or people from next door who saw them as a useful source of making money and providing shall we say, the raw bodies that could be used to trade for everything from guns to cloth to other items that people wanted. Whatever people wanted, they could get by taking either people or things like ivory.
One of the profoundly touching impressions in your book was your vivid descriptions of the cruelty that accompanied enslavement, the way the enslaved were treated on their long journey, the violence inflicted upon them before they got to their ultimate homes. As you said, you could follow the skeletons and figure out where the slavery trails led. Why do you think people were so cruel?
To that, I have no answer. I'm afraid people have been cruel to each other down the years. There's nothing special about the way Europeans or Indians or anybody else treated Africans or Africans treated each other. I'm afraid we all treat each other in this appalling way. But you're absolutely right. The way in which Europeans took Africans across the ocean was any better than anyone else treated them. And they were absolutely appalling. There were these tiny spaces that men and women were crammed into, kept there in chains. They even employed slaves as special guardians to beat them and to prevent riots and resistance. And the most appalling example of the British is the case of the Zong in the 18th century, where a captain thought perhaps he was running out of water. He threw 133 Africans overboard alive. This only came to a court because the company looked for insurance payments on the loss of their property, by which they mean the slaves. They wanted money back for the slaves they had themselves thrown overboard. And a British court just said, this is outrageous, you can't have it. That was, in fact, a huge blow to the slave trade when it happened. It's called the Zong massacre. Absolutely appalling things. So I'm afraid it's terrible then and it's terrible now. I mean, you can still find bodies in the Sahara almost on the same routes, with people trying to escape as refugees and migrants to get to places like Libya, almost along the same routes taken as slaves.
Well, that brings me to the next point, the legacy of historic slavery. Growing up in India, nobody told me about African slaves coming to India and working in upper income households. Your book talks about the stigma, for example, attached to the survivors to the current day. Can you tell us more about that? We know quite a bit about the descendants of transatlantic slavery in the Americas, but what's happened to the descendants of slavery, say in Turkey or Middle East or India?
We haven't had much research done on it. In India, the case has been looked at. And you may know a group called the Siddhis who live in both India and Pakistan, and they complain that they are still discriminated against. They are much smaller than descendants of the African populations in the United States for one simple reason. Most Africans taken as slaves to the Indian subcontinent were men, because they were used as fighting troops. And some of them rose to great heights because they were extremely successful and powerful. There's somebody well known in the Deccan called Amba Malik, who was extraordinarily successful. He held off the attacks from the Mughal emperors and was recognized as being a hugely significant figure. And there's still plenty of paintings of him. And he's held in some regard. There is some legacy, but much smaller than in America, because these soldiers either had to integrate with the local community or they died out. They took Indian wives or had a relationship with Indians and gradually melded into the local communities. So there aren't many communities which still recognize that relationship.
Integration was a better outcome than separate development. Are you saying that Indians treated the slaves better than the Americans treated theirs?
I have no evidence for them being treated any better. It is just that they were different because they were almost all men, while in America there were many women that were brought because they were also useful. And one of the most poignant examples I had from America is a wonderful quote from a woman called Elizabeth Freeman, who in Massachusetts in 1781 stood up and said, "Any time while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me and I had been told that I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it. Just to stand on God's earth, a free woman, I would." It tells you the pain that everyone feels when they are enslaved.
Absolutely. Coming back to Africa itself, what is the legacy of the slavery by Africans, of Africans trading with foreigners and exporting their own fellow African human beings to other continents? What's the legacy of that history in current politics, in current affairs, in the current state of development of Africa?
It's something we need to do more research on, but it is pretty clear. If you look at the areas of greatest conflict in Africa, most, but by no means all, we found exactly along that line at which the Arabs and Berbers came south across the Sahara and enslaved the Africans in the Sahel. In other words, in parts of northern Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone. And if you look at the problems that it produced in places like Sudan, you still have people in Sudan who are described by Arabs as slaves. And that term is still used to this day in 5 African countries, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Libya, and Sudan. You can still buy, sell, and own or inherit people in those countries. I'm not talking about the modern forms of enslavement, which are terrible enough in themselves. but actually ownership. That continues to this day. And the fact that we have nothing said by the Arab League, which has 10 members in Africa, and very little said by the African Union is absolutely shocking.
The way you describe it rings bells for me during my time heading the UN in Sudan, where we know about Darfur, the earlier genocide, and the current one going on. But I had never really fully understood the foundation of the visceral differences between the Arab populations of Sudan and the marginalized peripheral black populations of both South Sudan and the Darfur region. But people look exactly the same. You can't tell looking at someone whether you are from Khartoum or from Darfur because of the intermixing that has taken place over a long period of time. And yet that visceral hatred or visceral racism, whatever you call it, has been seeding conflicts for generations. Can you tease out the links between colonialism and slavery? I think for many people, it's just all conflated together. The simple narrative is colonialism happened, it enslaved a lot of people, it exploited others, those white capitalists came and did all horrible things. And colonialism and slavery are more or less taken together. But there is a difference between the two. What's the legacy of colonialism on the enslavement experience?
In reality, there's almost none. Because if you look at slavery, certainly the transatlantic slave trade, the British ended it by 1830s and then went around the world trying to tell people they should not enslave people anymore. And they went as far as the Ottoman Empire, they went to Ethiopia, and they really spent generations trying to stop it. They actually put 2 squadrons of boats off, one off West Africa, one off East Africa. In West Africa alone, they lost 17,000 sailors trying to stop enslavement and people being taken across and they did free about 150,000 captured slaves. So that was a huge effort. But actually colonialism by 1870 was only along the west coast of Africa in tiny portions. Yes, the north of Africa had been taken by the French, basically as an attempt to stop the Barbary pirates or corsairs, and the Cape and Natal had been taken by the British, and parts of Angola and Portugal had taken parts of Mozambique. But about 85% of Africa was completely free. There were no colonies. It was only after in the 1880s and the Congress of Berlin that there was this free-for-all scramble for Africa. And the scramble takes place at least 50 years after most European countries had finished slavery. So the connection between slavery and colonialism is very weak, much weaker than people think.
That's a very interesting historical point you make, an important correction to the popular prejudice. In your book, I recall you talk about how some communities welcomed the British colonialists to come in and free them from slavery. So while the colonial enterprise was going on, in parallel, the colonialists were trying to rid the world of this evil. So are you saying that colonialism has some good points?
I'm not in favor of colonialism, but if you take something like the Sokoto Caliphate, which few people have heard of, but extended all the way from Cameroon to Burkina Faso and basically northern Nigeria and Niger. At the time of the War of Independence, the American Civil War in the 1860s, there were about 4 million Africans and descendants in America. There were about 4 million African slaves in the Sokoto Caliphate, which had nothing to do with colonialism. And Britain came up the Niger River, conquered the Sokoto Caliphate, and in the early 1900s, having not had any slaves in the British Empire for about 50 or 60 years, all of a sudden they found they had 2 million African slaves on their hands, and Lord Lugard, who is today seen as a reprehensible character because he was involved in colonialism, and I wouldn't deny that for a moment. He all of a sudden had 2 million slaves that he had to free. And it took him about 20 years to do it, because if he freed them all at once, the entire economy of the caliphate would have collapsed, because it was built on enslavement. And the enslavement that they used was essentially similar to the United States. There were dyeing pits, growing cotton and other crops, and the caliphate sent maybe 150,000 people to the coastline of Nigeria and Ghana, and then on to Brazil. That's where Brazil got a large number of their slaves from. That's just history. It doesn't make anybody think that anyone did any better or worse. It just is.
Speaking of history and what we see around us, Britain is getting a lot of bad press nowadays for many reasons. Many Western countries are. But how come the British suddenly got a moral enlightenment and decided to not just abolish slavery in their own empire, but make it a crusade where they went to the Ottomans, into the Portuguese waters in Brazil, and inspected ships of other powers on the high seas to enforce their anti-slavery code? How come the British got so morally armed by this mission?
Well, it's a fascinating question. But as I understand it, there was a transformation in British thinking. I talked about the Zong and how that shocked British society, which certainly did. And then gradually there was a moral crusade built mostly around Christians, particularly the Quakers. And once the Quakers decide that something needs doing, they will go on no matter how many generations it takes. And they're very moral people. And they made this the principal issue of Britain, of the Foreign Secretary, try to end slavery wherever found. And they really went a long way to do this. They weren't always successful, and many slaves who the British freed on boats that they captured going to the Americas died before they could be taken home. And where was home? They didn't know where most of these people had been captured. So they tended to be dumped in places like Liberia and Sierra Leone because they didn't know where to put them. This caused a lot of problems. The history of Liberia, for example, is a history of clashes between freed African slaves and local populations. And you see that impact to this day. It's a tragic one.
The moral imperative behind the anti-slavery movement, we can actually see it, the direct links between that to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights many decades later, and the norms and conventions around human rights that have grown up since then. But there are many wrongs in our world, aren't there? One doesn't even know where to start in terms of the atrocities being committed in war zones, or inequalities and so on, poverty compounded by deprivations of many sorts. Migration is a desperate reaction to all sorts of political as well as climatic changes. Do you think we'll ever have another great moral movement in our lifetime? You and I are both quite old, so that may be a very short time. But why are we not having great moral movements at the current in our current age?
I think we have them. You look at the remark by Martin Luther King: the arc of history bends towards freedom. I can't quote him exactly, but it was something like that. And I think he was right. I do think that in general, there's a greater understanding that humanity is one family. And that is embodied in the declarations of the United Nations, although they are frequently ignored. And the United Nations is frequently disparaged and derided. For me, though, those are the basic tenets of our ethical bedrock. I think that will, in the end, win out, but I'm afraid there are many battles to go before we get there, and I don't think there's any guarantee. And the thing that worries me is the amorality of so many people. People often criticize religions. There's no doubt all religions have done terrible things. I remember in Sri Lanka where the Buddhist monks, who were supposed to be tremendously pacific, had been behind some of the worst atrocities against the Tamils. But I do think that it's terrible that there has been such a loss of faith in anything, and that some of the worst atrocities are committed by people who believe in nothing except their material circumstances. And that for me is rock bottom, to believe in yourself and your comfort. I think that is completely wrong.
You mentioned being optimistic about the future, but there were many battles to fight. One of the battles is about whether one can correct history by reparations. There is a very divisive debate going on about reparations, especially in the Caribbean. They're asking for billions and trillions as compensation for historic slavery. How useful is that debate and those kinds of demands in terms of building a better world today, correcting the past?
I completely understand where the idea comes from. It's not for me to make a judgment on people's feelings. I'm not a moral philosopher. What I would say, however, is that the numbers involved are so stratospheric that sure as heck they're never going to be paid out. Well, then what is the point of making those demands? And if you're going to ask the British, or should we say the Portuguese, who actually did more trading across the Atlantic than the British, for these vast sums of money, why do the Sudanese not turn to the Egyptians and say, you've traded us for 5,000 years. We want everything you own. Why shouldn't the Ethiopians turn to Saudi Arabia and say, your bloodlines are full of our DNA because of the slaves down the centuries? Pay up. And then you could even go within countries. Why don't the southern Ethiopians ask the highland Ethiopians for payment, because it was the highlanders who basically enslaved them and sold them to the Arabs? So where do you end with this impossible series of A demands from B, B demands from C, C demands from, and so it goes on. Even Britain, for example, there were 30,000 Britons who were taken to North Africa as slaves by the Barbary corsairs. Are they going to now ask the Moroccans, Algerians, and who knows what for reparations? This is just an unending debate and gets you nowhere. So I think we should all recognize that we should talk about these issues. We should make the history known to each other and discussed. And for example, Saudi Arabia should stop closing its archives and preventing discussion of their role. Now, that is totally wrong, I think. Open debate, clear understanding, sharing of information, that for me is the way forward. But if people want to go on talking about reparations, it's a complete dead end.
There is a parallel issue here, isn't it, in climate change as well? The discussion going on of massive reparations and compensations due from early industrial powers. Unbroken Chains. It's a great title. It's a forbidding title. It raises a lot of questions. Where does the unbroken part of it come?
Well, if I'm right in thinking that there are 5 countries in where the African enslavement continues to this day, then those chains are indeed unbroken. And until we can persuade African leaders and the wider community to begin to smash those chains and make sure that people are genuinely free, I don't think we can say that slavery is at an end.
That's in the context of African slavery. But from the title, your book made me think about modern forms of slavery, contemporary slavery, and how we have human trafficking, which is a huge live political issue in Europe in particular. We have forced labor of various forms, sexual bondage, and many other forms of contemporary slavery. Are we doomed as human beings to be constantly exploiting each other?
As long as greed is one of our major motivations, yes.
And then what is the key message from your book? If we've always enslaved others and treated them brutally, and we're going to carry on doing the same for the future, just the form of atrocity or the exploitation will shift because the world is shifting through the millennia. What's the point of your book?
The point of my book is to open people's eyes to traditional slavery, chattel slavery, ownership, control, inheritance of people. That is my only focus. I have not gone into other forms of modern slavery, other forms of control, other forms of brutality, all of which should be dealt with. But, one book trying to deal with 5,000 years is enough for me.
Maybe your next book will be on the other forms of slavery. Martin, it's been a real eye-opener speaking with you. You shed a much-needed light on a a strangely familiar topic, but actually where much was hidden in the shadows, which you have exposed through your scholarship. And I think by inviting us to find out more about the origins of our societies and our interactions with other societies and the roles that our ancestors played, echoes of which continue to the present day, I think that's given our listeners something to think about. Your revealing book, Unbroken Chains, released on 20th of August, and it doesn't read like a dry history book, I can assure our listeners. It's actually reads like a thriller. I think one day probably a movie is going to be made out of it. Martin, thank you very much for joining me today on Fading Causes.
Well, thank you very much. And let me just say what an extraordinary role you played in Sudan, as well as in other conflicts, in exposing the brutality and the inhumanity of people. So thank you.